Hi, I'm Sabine, the Purpose Lawyer. Thank you for listening. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast. It really goes a long way. It helps us spread the good word. And if you or anybody you know is in the market for legacy or estate planning or business or trademarks, please reach out to our firm. It's the Ambitious Legacy Firm. We are licensed in New York and New Jersey, but we have service partners in all states. So we'd love to work with you. Asset protection, legacy planning, trademarks. We got you. All right. So it's theambitiouslegacyfirm.com. Now let's get into the episode. Welcome to another episode of the Ambitious Legacy Podcast. I'm your host, Sabine, the Purpose Lawyer. Thank you for listening and thank you for helping me be on purpose. So today I'm going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, relationships. But I'm not going to be talking about the juicy stuff that you guys probably like to hear and like to get into. I'm going to be talking about something that actually matters, which is making sure you protect your assets when considering relationships or exiting relationships, right? So I get this question a lot. So like a lot of people ask about, what do I do if I'm getting into a relationship or I'm getting out of a relationship? What is the best way to set it up? And what I found is, I'm going to, get into some of those tips. So what I found is a lot of people who don't ask these questions, right? They're just simply separating, going on with their lives and just not even worried about or concerned with what's happening with their assets. And so, that could be dangerous. And that's another way that, people are, generations lose a lot because whomever you intended it to go to ends up being the loser in the situation. And that oftentimes ends up being your kids and things like that because you didn't set up your assets, your legacy the right way. So I'm going to give you 7 tips that you need to consider when you are exiting or entering a relationship, whether you're married or not, right? So these are some things that are going to be universal that everybody can use. But before I get into that, I definitely wanted to highlight that what you really should be doing is setting up your assets the right way before you enter into these relationships. So maybe that's not just a relationship that you're dating, but absolutely if you are getting married, you want to consider how to separate your assets. So I do speak to a lot of clients about this when they're, getting ready to get married or thinking about getting married and they want to know like what to sort of do. And so the best way to sort of separate your assets and make sure that it's truly yours and there's no confusion as to whether this should be marital or if it should be, separate, is to really utilize a trust. So you can set up your own separate trust before you get married, and you put your personal assets that you acquired before that marriage into that trust. And whatever you guys build together, you can build together. You can start another trust jointly together with the assets that you guys acquire over time. But at least if something doesn't go right, you get to leave with what you came with, right? And the reason why that's a good tool or a good strategy is because when divorce is on the table, courts really look at what, they really take a microscope and look at what all the assets that the families have. And even if it's clear that I owned this before and, it was mine and, before the date of the marriage, I had it, sometimes it can be called into question, right? Depending on how you treated it, if the spouse, contributed to it, after you were married. So you never want to have that be a part of the conversation, right? You want to at least know that what you came in with is yours. And so putting it in a trust really draws a hard line and shows the intention that these assets were meant to be kept separately, were meant to be held separately. And you can, within that trust, decide to, leave it to maybe prior children, if you have children from a prior marriage or other family members. And then, like I said, building your new situation with your new spouse. And so not only is a trust, good for that situation, but usually I like to layer on protections, right? Just because you never know, like courts do have a lot of discretion when it comes to divorce. And so having also a prenuptial agreement, your trustee prenuptial agreement that everybody loves to talk about, having that also allows you to create a greater separation. Probably better set expectations is what I want to say. So you go into it knowing this is what we intend for this relationship. And if we're married for a certain period of time, this is what would happen. If we're married for longer, this is what will happen. If we have children, things of that nature. It's not just for the ultra wealthy, right? Because as we know, when you're building wealth, time is what actually allows your wealth to grow. So you may not be starting with $1 million, but whatever you're starting with now could mean a lot for your next generation. So it is important to set it up that way going into it. So now let's get into the 7 things that you want to consider if you are exiting a relationship, right? And so one of the things that is important is if you are actually getting separated, like I said in the beginning, that needs to be in writing. So you don't want to necessarily just walk away from a relationship and not separate, your rights, right? So within a separation agreement, each spouse can waive their rights to any future assets or waive their rights to what each other owns or not. You can also just come up with agreement with who's going to get what and what that's going to look like. Because if you don't and you just walk away from the relationship now and something happens to one of you, the other person's going to be entitled to their marital rights. And that's usually going to be a huge chunk, if not all of your estate they'll be entitled to. And so either it's for you or if you know somebody or a family or a parent, you should sort of spread this information because it's important to not just walk away and expect that, everything will take care of itself, because just because you intend someone to receive your assets doesn't mean that they will, right? And so that's, like I said, that's a way that wealth is lost because it's going to someone who you didn't intend it to go to because you're no longer together. So actually get separated, make sure it's in writing, make sure it's filed in the court so that that could be a legal separation, right? The next thing you want to do is talk to your financial professionals. So if you have accountants, financial advisors, you want to have a conversation with them about this separation. You want to do it ahead of tax season, right? Because one, you want to come up with strategies to separate, like say if you had investment accounts, you want to come up with strategies to separate those because you may not be able to just pull them apart at the time. Or you want to come up with a situation of how you're going to co-own them. Maybe you introduce an LLC and the LLC owns the accounts now, and now you guys can co-own them as just individuals. So there are things that you could do, but you definitely want to plan ahead of time. Another thing is with taxes. So I had a situation with a couple who got divorced, and because they got divorced and the husband was no longer, didn't have as many dependents, didn't have the wife as a dependent, have the children as a dependent, ended up with a huge tax burden. And so that really could have been avoided if he had some 4 conversations with his financial, professionals, his accountant, his CPA, to really plan what that's going to look like so that you're not stuck with a huge tax burden. So that's something else that people don't realize. And that is something that will obviously hurt your wealth, right? Because it was like a 5-figure tax burden, something like 70 plus. So you want to make sure that that's something that you take a look at. Talk to your financial professionals. So the third thing is to separate joint accounts. So something with joint accounts that you should know is that each person is entitled to 100% of the funds within those accounts, right? So even though it's joint and you think like, okay, we own this 50-50. No, if one person goes and takes out all of the money out of their account, they will be in the right. So there's nothing, really wrong with that. So if that's not your intention, things are not going the way that you expect them to go, you want to make sure that you actually separate those accounts or take those names off of those accounts moving forward. Even if the other person's like, I'm not using the account or whatever, you don't want to leave that power sort of hanging out there. I had a couple way back in the beginning of my career when I was dealing with divorces, or part of divorces is how I felt like it was. The wife went and took out a sizable amount from the spouse's business account because she was on the account and her name was on the business as well as an authorized signer. So she was able to do that and nothing could be done, even though it was reported in the divorce. It was like, And so the courts don't like to go back and meddle in what happened while you were in the relationship. They kind of just want to deal with what happens once it ends and what that's going to look like. So it's kind of like, okay, you decided to do whatever you did because it was a contract, right? But once things are over, that's when they start looking at things. So things can get nasty before it actually ends. Please look at your joint accounts and look at the rights each other's have over each other's properties, so that you can see, is this something I want to allow to continue, or is it time to really start to dial back these responsibilities and authorities. So I kind of talked about investment accounts. Spoiler, that was one of the things. You need to change your beneficiaries on the investment accounts. The investment accounts, you can select for your investment account who you would want to receive those benefits if you were to pass away. So naturally, you may have each other on your investment accounts. You may not have any beneficiaries on your investment accounts. It's definitely something to look at. When I plan with clients, I usually ask them these questions like, do you have, an investment account? Do you have, who are your beneficiaries? So that they can kind of look at these things and see, is this still what I want? Did I even select anybody? But it's something that you want to make sure that you change, because if you have, whether it's a sizable portfolio or not, you want to make sure that it's going to who you want. So if you're married and you're separating, or you're in a relationship and you're separating, make sure you make those changes to those accounts. All right. The fifth thing I did: 1, settlement, right? If you have a settlement, have that in writing. 2, talk to your financial professionals. 3, separate your joint accounts. And 4, investment accounts. 5 is deeds. Now, how do we own real estate? So owning real estate, it's very important that your title is held in the way that you want it to be held. Why? Because when you own real estate, even if you have a will or a trust, if your real estate title is not titled in the right way, in the way that you want it to go, like say in the name of your trust or in your sole separate name, then when you pass away, it can go a number of ways, right? So if the title is held jointly and you and your spouse is on there, if one person passes away, then title will automatically go to the other person. They'll get it 100%. That's called joint tenants with right of survivorship. Now, that's okay if you're married and you're in a relationship and you're happy for that to happen. But if that's not what you want, then that's something that you need to change. The other way is it's tenants in common. So that means if one of you pass away, then their 50% goes to their heirs, your 50% goes to your heirs, etc. That is usually going to be the way that you want it to go if you're going to continue to own property together, because sometimes there is a reason to continue to own property together. So I had a couple that had gotten divorced, but they had a number of real estate properties in prime areas that was highly appreciating at the time, and they did not want to sell. So they continued to own the properties together until it was the right time to sell. And in that case, you don't want it to be jointly, because you don't want 100% of your assets to go to your ex-spouse. You probably 50%, whatever their ownership share is. Yeah, sure, but not the whole thing. So they had to address that and change their titles to make sure that they covered that situation if that were to arise. So make sure you check your deeds and make sure that title is held in a way that you want. Or if you have a trust, it should absolutely be owned by your trust, unless you have some other strategy put in place. That is number 5. So number 6 is retirement accounts. Retirement accounts is a big thing, because a lot of times when you set up your retirement account, it's when you first get your job and you never look at it again. If you're doing it through an employer. And so people tend to just forget about that, changing the beneficiary on their retirement account. I had a young man whose father had remarried, and the spouse was nowhere to be. He had remarried and then got divorced. Not divorced. What am I saying? He remarried, but then was separated. The spouse was nowhere to be found. And when the father passed away, the son found out that the spouse was the beneficiary on the account. And so there was nothing that he could do about it, because it was already done. His father had passed, and so the monies were just staying with the employer. And this happens a lot. Each state has an Office of Unclaimed Funds. New York has something like 16 billion or something crazy like that. And that's just from people passing away without making an alternative plan for their assets, right? Nobody knows that it exists, or nobody can get it. And so then it's just stuck there. And so that is something that happens a lot when you do not make those changes. So you got to check your beneficiaries. And even on insurance policies, you want to make sure that you check your beneficiaries. And that I find often when I'm talking to people, that they'll be like, oh, yeah, that needs to be changed. That shouldn't be the way that it is now. So think about those things. That is number 6. You want to make sure that you think about the retirement accounts and your insurance accounts. And then finally, credit. You want to safeguard your credit. If you have credit cards together, or sometimes you have a co-user on your, or joint user on your credit cards, you want to make sure that you separate that so that you are not allowing your spouse the opportunity to run up credit over time. All right, so those are some things that can get overlooked. I definitely want you to pay attention to these 7 things that we just talked about. Even if things don't go the way that you think they were going to go when you entered into these relationships, at least you put some planning in place. At least you took some steps to safeguard your future and your legacy. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube, and please don't forget to download and on the podcast platforms. I'm going to get it together today. Have a good one.